The OPP Constable was on my porch before the mist had lifted off the lake. He held a legal envelope against his chest, his cruiser lights dark, his expression the careful kind that men wear when they are about to deliver news they didn't choose to carry. Across the gravel drive, my son-in-law was parked sideways across the lane in his new Lexus SUV, window down, phone raised, filming every second of it with the relaxed satisfaction of a man who believed the hard work was already done. "Move it along, old-timer," he called out, his voice carrying easily through the October air. "This place belongs to Caldwell Property Partners now. You've got no legal claim to stand on." I looked down at the official notice the constable had just placed in my hands. Transfer of title. Notice to vacate. My name at the top, the address of the property my late wife and I had spent 31 years, turning from a rundown fishing cabin into a proper home. The address printed beneath the letterhead of my son-in-law's company, as though it had always been theirs to claim. I adjusted my reading glasses. I read the first line carefully, and then I asked the constable one single quiet question. The color left his face so fast I thought he might need to sit down. "My name is Roland Dempsey. I am 67 years old. I spent 34 years as a structural engineer with a firm that built bridges, overpasses, and water infrastructure across this country. Projects from the lower mainland of British Columbia right across to the Maritimes. I retired 5 years ago to this 3-acre lakefront property in the Kawartha Lakes district of Ontario. A piece of land my wife and I purchased when our daughter was still small enough to sit on my shoulders. We built this place slowly and with our own hands. The boathouse, the wraparound deck, the stone fireplace in the great room, the gardens my wife planted along the south-facing slope, all of it assembled over 3 decades of weekends and summers and retirement mornings when there was nowhere else I wanted to be. My wife passed away 2.5 years ago. Dementia. 4 years of decline that I watched one careful increment at a time, the way a structural engineer watches a bridge grade. Knowing the load-bearing capacity is dropping, unable to stop the eventual failure, able only to document it and keep everything as stable as possible for as long as you can. I kept my grief in the same place I had always stored difficult things, folded down, sealed tight, set aside. There was work to do. The property needed maintaining. The dock needed replanking before the ice came back. My daughter and her husband visited regularly in the months after the funeral. They brought casseroles, watched hockey with me on Sunday evenings, called to check in. My son-in-law had always carried the easy confidence of a man who considered himself the smartest presence in any gathering. He ran a real estate investment company out of Markham. A polished operation with a proper website and a glass front office and a vehicle that got swapped out for something newer every 2 years. He talked about the market the way some men talk about the weather, constantly, fluently, and with the assumption that everyone around him found it equally interesting. I had never entirely warmed to him. He had a habit of interrupting my daughter when she was mid-sentence, then summarizing what she had been about to say, as though he had arrived at the idea himself. But she seemed content, and I was not the kind of father who confused his own discomfort with proof of wrongdoing. That changed on a Tuesday evening in late November. They arrived just after 9 o'clock with no call ahead. My son-in-law was in the clothes he had worn to the office. Suit jacket, no tie, collar open, and my daughter had clearly been crying. Her eyes were swollen, and she shook through the hug she gave me at the door, the full-body shiver of someone who has been holding herself together for a long drive, and finally stopped. I brought them inside and put the kettle on, and she told me the situation in fragments. A development deal had collapsed. A partner had pulled out at the final stage, triggering a cascade of defaults. The company's operating line of credit had been frozen pending a legal dispute. The legal bills were significant. The bank was reviewing their personal assets. If they could not demonstrate sufficient collateral within the week, they stood to lose the house in Markham. My son-in-law lifted his head from his hands and looked at me with the face of a man who had rehearsed this moment, though I did not know that yet. "We're not asking you for money," he said carefully. His voice was quieter than I was used to. "I know that's not something you'd do lightly, and it's not what we need. What the bank needs to see is a substantial asset supporting the corporate portfolio, real property, something that demonstrates long-term equity. If we can show them this place, just on paper, just as managed equity within a family trust structure, the loan gets approved and we're through this." I tensed immediately. This property was not a tool. It was my home and the last physical connection I had to my wife. He raised both hands, palms out. I understand that completely, he said. What I'm describing isn't a mortgage. It's a family estate freeze. It's the standard instrument that estate lawyers set up to protect inherited property from capital gains tax when the time comes. You've held this land since 1993. The accrued gain on a Kawartha's lakefront property over 30 years is enormous. At the time of your estate, the CRA could claim 40% of that gain. An estate freeze locks the value now, structures it inside a family holding entity, and eliminates that tax exposure. I would be the managing director. You remain the occupant and beneficiary for your lifetime. Nothing changes for you. The bank sees the asset, approves the line of credit, and the company survives. It was a convincing pitch. The tax implications of holding appreciated real estate in Ontario are genuinely significant, and a family trust arrangement is a legitimate strategy that estate lawyers across this province set up routinely. He spoke in the language of a man who understood these instruments, which he did. He simply understood them the way a locksmith understands locks, not for the purpose of keeping things safe, but for the purpose of opening things he had no right to open. My daughter reached across the table and took my hand. Her fingers were cold from the drive. Mom always said this place would stay in the family forever, she said quietly. She made you both promise. If we lose everything, we lose the connection to her too. Please, Dad. We just need this one thing. She knew exactly what she was doing. She knew that the word mom, in that context, would travel further than any financial argument. She knew that my wife's death was a wound that had not closed, and she pressed it with the precision of someone who had identified the exact point of structural weakness and calculated the required load. I told them to come back in the morning with the paperwork. The man he brought was introduced as the company's notary, a thin, jittery fellow in a beige sport coat who kept adjusting his collar and smelled faintly of stale coffee. He set a thick binder on my kitchen table and stepped back, while my son-in-law walked me through the opening pages. The language was exactly as described: family trust formation, estate freeze provisions, designation of a managing director, capital gains deferral structure. It all tracked with what he had laid out the evening before. I read the first dozen pages carefully. They matched. I was tired. My daughter's voice was still in my head. I put my pen where the yellow tabs told me to put it and signed, page after page, and somewhere in the middle of that binder, my son-in-law's hand hovered just slightly closer to my shoulder than it needed to. I never read the page they had buried in the center of the stack. I had no idea that amid the routine corporate boilerplate, they had inserted a transfer deed of land, a document that, under Ontario's land registry system, legally conveyed the full title to my property to Caldwell Property Partners Incorporated. One signature, obtained under manufactured emotional duress, handed over a 3-acre Kawartha's lakefront property appraised at over $2 million. By that afternoon, my daughter called. Her voice was warm and light. She thanked me, said the bank had already pre-approved the line of credit, said everything was going to be fine. She sounded, I thought, a great deal better than someone who had been in tears less than 24 hours earlier. I poured myself a coffee and looked out at the lake and told myself that families go through things. I had no idea the clock on my own displacement had already started running. 6 weeks later, on a Thursday afternoon in early January, I was splitting wood at the south edge of the property when I noticed someone walking the perimeter along the waterfront. He was carrying survey equipment, a digital theodolite on a yellow tripod, a tablet strapped to his forearm. He wore a high-visibility vest and moved along the shoreline with the purposeful, systematic pace of someone executing a professional task rather than admiring the view. I set down the axe and walked toward him. He introduced himself as a land surveyor contracted by a Markham-based firm. When I asked what he was surveying and on whose instruction, he checked his tablet and read out the company name without hesitation: Caldwell Property Partners. He told me the survey was the preliminary step for a subdivision application. The plans attached to his work order proposed splitting the lot into 4 separate waterfront parcels, each projected to list at between $600,000 and $900,000 in the current market. I thanked him politely and walked back to the house. I went to the study and opened my laptop and went directly to the Ontario Land Registry online search portal. I entered my civic address and my legal property description. The registered owner on file was not my name. It was Caldwell Property Partners Incorporated, dated 3 days after I had signed those documents at my kitchen table. I closed the laptop. I stood at the window and watched the January light going flat and gray over the lake. The dock was pulled up for the winter, stacked on the shore the way my wife and I always stored it, the way I had done alone these past 2 winters. I was an engineer for 34 years. My entire professional life was built around one foundational discipline. When the readings do not match the stated conditions, you do not assume the instruments are wrong. You check the structure. I drove to their house in Markham that Saturday morning, timing it for when I knew they would be out. I rang the bell twice. No answer. I walked around to the recycling bins at the side gate and came away with 2 knotted bags of cross-cut paper shredding. I spent the better part of that weekend on my kitchen floor, under a work lamp, with tape and tweezers, and the patience that comes from a career spent reading structural drawings in poor light. By Sunday evening, I had pieced together enough to understand the full scope of what had been built against me. There was an internal email chain. The earliest message was dated 14 months before my wife's funeral. They had been planning this since before she died. They had sat at her bedside and helped her drink water through a straw, and the entire time they were running the numbers on her lakefront property. There was a financial summary, a subdivision sale projected at approximately $2.9 million. 12% allocated to legal and notary costs. The remainder directed to offshore holding accounts in stages small enough to avoid FinTrack reporting thresholds. And there was a loan agreement from TD Bank. My son-in-law had walked the fraudulently registered transfer deed of land to a mortgage specialist and used the full equity of my property as collateral against a home equity line of credit worth $1.8 million. The funds had already been drawn. That explained the Lexus. That explained the new coat my daughter had been wearing, and the skiing trip to Whistler she had mentioned in passing. The one I had assumed they could finally afford, because the company had recovered. I locked the reconstructed documents in the fireproof safe in my study. I drove into Lindsay and found a payphone and placed a call to a trust and estate litigation firm in Toronto that a former colleague had once mentioned in passing, years ago, during a conversation about protecting family property from future complications. The lawyer I reached, I will call her Agnès, which is not her full name, had the manner of someone who had spent 20 years dismantling corporate frauds and found the work neither exciting nor distasteful, simply necessary. When I finished explaining, she was quiet for a moment. "Come into the office," she said. "Bring everything you have." I spent 4 hours in her boardroom 2 days later. When she came back into the room after a consultation with her associates, she sat down and folded her hands on the table. "The transfer deed of land is fraudulent," she said. "The execution was coerced and misrepresented. That alone gives you a civil cause of action. But before I file anything, I want to confirm something with you." She slid a document across to me. "Tell me about the trust your wife's estate lawyer set up in 2019. I had forgotten for a moment that it existed. In 2019, shortly after my wife's diagnosis became definitive, her doctor had strongly recommended that we put our affairs in order while she still had legal capacity. Her estate lawyer in Peterborough had walked us through our options. One of the instruments she recommended was an alter ego trust, an irrevocable trust structure available to Canadians over 65, designed to hold real property outside the estate and outside the reach of creditors, with the grantor retaining the right to occupy the property for their lifetime, while the legal title vests in an independent corporate trustee. We had done it. The property had been in that trust for nearly 5 years. My name had not been on the legal title since 2019. Agnès looked at me across the boardroom table, and for the first time in that meeting, something shifted in her expression from professional attention to something closer to admiration. "The transfer deed of land your son-in-law filed is void," she said simply. "You have no legal authority to transfer a property held in an alter ego trust. The title was never yours to convey." He presented a null document to TD Bank and drew $1.8 million against an asset he cannot legally hold. That is mortgage fraud under Section 380 of the Criminal Code of Canada, maximum sentence of 14 years. "He doesn't know about the trust," I said. "He doesn't know," she confirmed. I asked her not to contact the bank and not to file anything yet. I needed 10 more days. I told her what I intended to do and why. She looked at me for a long moment. 10 days, she said. After that, I'm going to the RCMP with or without you. I drove back to the Kawarthas and began the final phase of my preparation. I had already been performing diminishment in small ways, not deliberately at first, but I recognized it as useful and refined it into a deliberate practice. I let my son-in-law find me confused about where I had put my keys. I called my daughter by her mother's name once, in front of him, watching him file it away as confirmation of what he already wanted to believe. I complained about my heart medication running low, because I had heard my son-in-law mention once, months earlier, that the property would be unencumbered within a year. I had not fully understood the comment at the time. I understood it now, and so I let the medication concern linger in their awareness like an open door. I invited my daughter for afternoon tea on a Thursday. She arrived in a new coat, carrying an expensive bag, wearing the particular expression of someone managing an obligation they have decided to treat as duty. I made tea badly on purpose, spilling a small puddle on the granite counter and wringing my hands over it while she cleaned it up with short, impatient strokes. She excused herself to use the washroom. She took her bag with her. I rose from my chair without any of the arthritic effort I had been performing all week. I moved to her coat, draped over the back of a kitchen chair. In the inner breast pocket, I placed a device I had purchased for cash at an electronics shop in Peterborough, a voice-activated digital recorder no larger than a matchbook, set to transmit to a receiver in my study. I was back in my chair, both hands wrapped around my mug, before I heard the bathroom door open. She left 40 minutes later, promising to call soon, already reaching for her phone before she reached the porch steps. That evening, I sat in my study in the dark and listened through the receiver. The recording quality was flawless. I heard her call him from the car before she had even cleared the township road. I heard him ask how it went. I heard her say I seemed genuinely worse, not just the usual forgetfulness. I heard her say she did not think we needed to worry about me contesting anything. And then I heard her say something else. She said the specialist I saw in Peterborough had my cardiac medication on a renewal schedule. She said it would take nothing more than a call to the pharmacy, suggesting the prescription was under clinical review, to delay the refill. She had the file number. She said a man in his late 60s with a compromised cardiac history, without his medication through a Canadian winter, would not last the season. She said the property would be clear of complications by spring, and the subdivision could proceed on schedule. She said all of this the way you might discuss a household errand, practical, calm, without a tremor. I sat in the dark for a very long time after the recording ended. 37 years I had been her father. I had coached her hockey team when she was 9 years old. I had driven 4 hours in a February blizzard to be at her bedside after her appendix came out. I had held her mother's hand through every conversation about what was coming, and absorbed the weight of watching the woman we both loved disappear by degrees. She had sat in my kitchen and drank the tea I made for her with shaking hands, and somewhere in the back of her mind she had been calculating the number of weeks my heart would last without its medication. I erased whatever had remained of my hesitation. I called Agnes that night and told her we were ready to move. She timed it with the RCMP. On the morning the constable arrived, a young OPP officer from the Lindsay detachment, clearly uncomfortable with his assignment. I was already standing at the kitchen window with a mug of coffee, watching his cruiser turn up the lane. My son-in-law arrived seconds later, Lexus angled sideways across the gravel, window down, phone raised. My daughter stepped out of the passenger side and stood near the rear of the vehicle with her arms crossed, wearing the expression of someone watching a long-anticipated process finally complete itself. I had set up a Bluetooth speaker on the porch railing the evening before, tucked between 2 clay planters. It was connected and ready. The audio file was queued. The constable handed me the notice. He explained that the title to the property had been transferred to Caldwell Property Partners, and that the notice to vacate was legally issued. He suggested gently that if I needed assistance arranging alternative accommodations, the county had resources available for seniors in transition. I took the document. I read the first paragraph. I looked up at him. "Before you proceed," I said, "I need you to understand something. This property has been held in an irrevocable alter ego trust since 2019. The grantor, meaning me, holds no legal authority to convey this title to anyone. Whoever filed this transfer deed of land did so using a null instrument, and that same null instrument was presented to a federally chartered bank to secure $1.8 million in mortgage financing. That is Section 380 of the Criminal Code. I held his gaze. Are you aware that you are about to execute an eviction on behalf of an active mortgage fraud? The constable's expression changed entirely. Across the lane, my son-in-law's grin went flat. I'd like you to hear something, I said, and I pressed play. My daughter's voice came out of that speaker at a volume that crossed the lane, reached the neighbors at the adjacent lot, and carried down the lakeshore in the October stillness. It was clear and unambiguous. There was no interpretation possible. She described my medication, my file number, the projected timeline for my death. Then my son-in-law's voice joined hers, and he explained the mechanics of the transfer, the fraudulently registered deed, the HELOC drawn against a void title, the funds moved offshore in stages. He mentioned the bank by name. He mentioned the amount. He laughed. He said the old man had not the faintest idea any of it was happening. The constable's hand went to his radio. My son-in-law dropped his phone. He threw the Lexus into reverse and got perhaps 30 feet before 3 RCMP vehicles came around the corner of the township road with their lights running and sealed the lane from both directions. 6 officers stepped out. Agnès emerged from the lead vehicle in her overcoat, looked up at me on the porch, and gave one brief nod. My son-in-law was removed from the vehicle and placed against the hood while he was still shouting about misunderstandings and corporate law and his right to legal counsel. The grounds for arrest were read to him in both official languages. He went quiet partway through. My daughter stood near the rear of the Lexus and watched what was happening to him, and then she turned and looked at me. I came down the porch steps and walked across that gravel and stood in front of her. The RCMP officers held their positions and gave us the moment. She looked the way people look when they have overbuilt a structure and watched it come down. Not with the shock of the unexpected, but with the hollow recognition of something they always knew was possible and chose not to calculate for. You didn't just try to take the property, I said. My voice was level and entirely without decoration. You planned to take my life. A call to a pharmacy and a Canadian winter would do the rest. You sat in my kitchen last Thursday and watched me spill my tea and helped me clean it up, and you had that plan in your back pocket the entire time. She said nothing. Her eyes were bright and wet and fixed on mine. The property was never yours to take, I said. It hasn't been in my name since 2019. Your husband filed a deed transfer against an asset that neither of us has the legal authority to convey. The bank holds no valid collateral. The subdivision will never break ground. There is nothing at the end of this, except what is standing in front of you right now. The officer placed a hand on her arm. The handcuffs made the sound that they make. I turned and walked back to the house without looking back. Welcome to Sunborn Vengeance. I'm glad you were here with me for this one. If this story stayed with you, if you know what it feels like to love someone who turned that love into a tool against you, or if you're carrying a home, a piece of land, something you spent your life building and were told was safe, then follow along. There are more stories coming that I think you'll want to hear. Before you go, leave me something in the comments. If you discovered that someone in your family had been working against you for years, would you confront them the moment you found out, or would you hold that knowledge close and wait until the ground was solid beneath you? I'd genuinely like to know. I went inside and put the kettle on. Through the south windows, the lake held the last of the October light, flat and gray and perfectly still. The property was mine. It had always been mine. They had simply forgotten to check.